We all need ambitious goals, and I have not had an ambitious goal in a long time. So I now have an ambitious goal. I achieved my first ambitious goal by getting that snowmobile to purr like a kitten. Oh, she's such a beauty. She's a Polaris. You know, she has that two-cylinder, two-stroke truck engine in it. It is literally a truck engine from like the early days of Fuji Heavy Industries little city trucks. It's just this unstoppable agricultural engine. It's just working on it is an absolute pleasure. I've just fell in love with the engine in that sled. Okay, so I achieved one ambitious goal for myself, which was to fall in love with a new snowmobile. Mission accomplished. Now for the second ambitious goal. Okay, the second ambitious goal is to extend the work that we have already done. By we, I mean myself, Dave, I can't remember everybody's name. I'm just not in the right frame of mind right now to have memories. I'll have memories later. I gotta refresh my memories, pull up Facebook or my, the old thing. There's just too many people, and I don't want to remember some people and leave other people out. So, okay. So, this is the ambitious goal, okay? To continue the work that we've already done on solar desalination and create a sound and robust solar desalination technology and infrastructure that can supply every single person who needs it with a source of solar desalinated potable water. And I think we can do it. I've been working on this problem for a very long time. I think we've all been working on the problem for a long time, not just us, not just me. I've been off in my own little direction, and other people have been off in other directions, and their research has added to definitely what I'm doing. I'm standing on the backs of giants, standing on the shoulders of giants, standing on the shoulders of giants. Oh, I'm throwing my hat, man. Geese. So we can do this. We can make a solar desalination technology that can be used easily by a child, can produce water with high thermodynamic efficiency, can be manufactured in the country in which it is used, and can add to local economies. The right solar desalination technology can save millions of lives. Because when you have clean water, you can fight easy to treat diseases like diarrhea and cholera. When you have clean water, people can live better. Obviously, solar desalinated water is not the only solution. It's also sanitation is part of it, and access to medical care and such. But without coliform-free water, an economy cannot accomplish very much. That coliform-free water is I would say, in the top 3 most important basic human needs. Air, coliform-free water, and of course a snowmobile. Because without a snowmobile, the air and the coliform free water don't mean much. Okay, so this is the first phase. We have to bring healthy water to people all over the world, like in Haiti and Ghana and Bangladesh and India, and they have to make these products for themselves in the country in which they live. And it can even start to displace countries, or start to displace energy hungry technologies in countries that are fairly advanced, like say Palau, which is an advanced country, but they need additional sources of water. They should be able to make their own solar desalination systems in Palau without needing to import them. It's possible with the right technology. Okay, but once that happens and everybody has this source of delicious water, sea panel water, seawater, it's got electrolytes. Actually, it doesn't have electrolytes. Okay, it was an inside joke with Dave. We used to have an old t-shirt with cPanel, and it was a picture of this big smoking factory on the back and all this pollution billowing up out of it. And you see these little, it's a beautiful, beautiful drawing, and this little this person standing next to this giant factory says, "Drink seawater, it has electrolytes." It was a joke because we were really into Idiocracy at the time. It's a great movie. I must have watched Idiocracy like 15 times. Okay, so that we put that on the back of our old t-shirts. We should probably reissue those. All right. Once we have water in all of these countries, we then need to bring them snowmobiles. And you see, that's a real problem because a lot of these countries are too hot for snow. And you know, with global warming, the way it's going, it's like it's going to be even harder to erect giant domes around these countries so that they can have snow all the time and ride snowmobiles. But you see, that's part of this thing, is we're going to have to get rid of all of these moderate, temperate, warm, lovely climates and replace them with snow-locked lands where the people can ride snowmobiles, because there's no other way they can truly be happy. I have found this out on my own. The only way a person can be truly happy is if they're on the back of a snowmobile. I used to think I knew happiness, but then I realized I didn't, because I wasn't on a snowmobile. All right. I got a jet. Everything's getting all messed up. All right. That's the ambitious goal, is to make an inexpensive desalination technology that can be used around the world, manufactured in the country of use, and allow for the people who need it most to change ocean water into drinking water, but then also in a very robust way, without worrying about contamination from sand filters and such, convert coliform contaminated water into solar distilled, both solar distilled and solar disinfected water. That the unit should do both. It should solar disinfect and it should operate as a solar still. Obviously, if you have a solar still, it by nature of the process, it's also solar disinfected. So, okay, the difference is solar disinfection is when you take a plastic bottle, you fill it full of water, and then you leave it in the sunlight, where you make sure the label doesn't block the sunlight or anything, because the plastic is not sufficient to block UV rays, and the UV rays have a short enough wavelength that they're able to essentially disconnect the reproductive mechanism of these little bugs that are in the water that cause diarrhea and cholera and such. So solar disinfection of water is a remarkably simple method of cleaning water, and it's used around the world. One of the cool things about solar disinfection with plastic bottles, they take these corrugated metal sheets and it concentrates the heat back so it acts as a mirror, but it also holds these bottles. So look, solar disinfection is a fantastic method, but there's many cases where you just can't use it that well. If the water is already somewhat cloudy, there's sufficient material, sufficient suspended particulate in the water that it blocks some portion of the light energy which reaches the bottom sides of these little particles. So you're not able to completely get rid of the coliform and or whatever other gunk vector is inside this whatever bacteria is inside this water. The vector is about mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are the vector for malaria. See, I'm not a biology guy, so it's hard for me to remember all this stuff. Okay, so in those cases, when you can't reliably solar disinfect water, or if it's ocean water, solar disinfection won't do anything, because if the person drinks it and it's already at, say, 32,000 parts per million of salt, they're not going to survive on that. You obviously can't drink salty water or even brackish water. It needs to safely be below approximately 500 parts per million to drink it. And really, people don't even, I mean, the kind of water we tend to drink in the United States of America and in other European countries is closer to 100, 200 parts per million. So the danger with having too high particulates, it's not necessarily like some of the total dissolved solids in the water are not necessarily going to hurt you, but they may not taste so good. But in some cases, by removing by bringing the TDS down to more delicious levels, in often cases, many cases, depending on the location, you've made a healthier water because you've removed some of the dissolved contaminants from agricultural runoff, such as arsenic and things that are in the water that shouldn't necessarily be there. One of the areas that I did research on very early when I was doing cPanel was our solar desalination methods were so effective that we had removed too much of the dissolved particulates in the water. So we were bringing 32,000 or 35,000 parts per million salt water down to approximately 10 parts per million. So 10 part per million water is tasty. It's nice and soft, but for long-term use, there's concern, and there's open debate on this, that it could demineralize someone's body, because you're putting in water which has a lower mineral concentration than your surrounding tissue, and it will, because of osmotic pressure and decreasing total entropy, or increasing total entropy, I should say. Your body has to do work to decrease the entropy. It can draw minerals out. So the idea at the time was to remineralize water with things that you wouldn't need to replace often. So for instance, we used I think like limestone and these quartz rocks that were hard enough, and it would be replicating the kind of good artesian water you would get. And it turns out, which interested me very much at the time, and I didn't quite know why, was when you plotted the remineralization of the water from these rocks, it didn't follow a linear curve. It happened all of a sudden, and then it tended to even out. It was I guess the shape of the curve would be, any additional remineralization was exponentially decreasing. So I didn't quite understand why that would be, because even when it remineralized, it wasn't anywhere close to what ocean water was. It would remineralize to 50 or 100 parts per million, which is good drinking water, but it didn't remineralize the way you would think ocean water would, and it didn't seem to be leading to a remineralization on the level of ocean water. Why does ocean water have 32,000 parts per million? It's a valid question. At some point, there's some precipitate that's going to come out once a water is saturated with a certain material. So some materials you can probably reach hypersalinities, 200 parts per million, 300 parts per million even. I mean, I think it's possible depending on the material. That is a really nice truck. Yep, the GMC, they made them beautiful. Okay. But in the ocean, you tend to see salinity around 32,000 parts per million. And you have places like the Red Sea where the salinity is even, or the Dead Sea where the salinity is even higher. But in geology, I was I'm sure there's probably better data out there now. It was never really clear to me why there were, the striation of the salinity within the water was clear because you had increasing pressure, which allowed for increasing salinity. And that was also part of the reason it seemed why different ocean creatures would swim to different levels, because they were sensitive to certain salinities. Salinity tends to increase with depth, which is also why you need to be careful with desalination when you're re-injecting these brines, because you're putting you can create a brine inversion where you have a higher concentration brine that wants to sink and a lower concentration brine that wants to rise, and you get something like an inversion layer. So reintroducing them in the right way is critical. Unfortunately, brine reintroduction is not a heavily policed area of emissions. We allow a lot of leeway with it, and I don't know that we're necessarily going to be able to do that very far in the future when desalination, very far in the future.com, when desalination becomes a stronger economic force. We're going to have to reintroduce that brine very carefully, and I think that involves, the mathematics of it are fascinating, I believe. It has to do with something called a card shuffling problem. And card shuffling problems can be used in a wide array of analysis. But the idea of a card shuffling problem is, the simplest form is literally card shuffling. If you have a deck of cards that are, say, have order in them, how many times do you have to put the deck in half, then stack it, and then do it again? Or say find a random point in there and then stack it and keep stacking again until you have a well-mixed card. So this number is something they can, depending on how you're defining your mixing, they can find how many times you have to shuffle your cards to have a well-mixed deck of cards. That's something related to, ironically, it's interesting, that's something related to brine reintroduction. That's essentially what's called a card shuffling problem, because you're taking a relatively high concentration of total dissolved solids after you finish desalinating. It could be 100 parts per million. It could be even a little higher than that if it's been concentrated. And you're reintroducing that into a lower concentration. So the disorder of the systems is different. The entropy of the systems is different. So when you mix entropies, how well do these mix? When you mix 100 parts per million TDS with 50 parts per million, does it mean you automatically get 75 parts per million? Depending on how well it's mixed? Maybe. You might get, 90 and 65. You might get different layers. It doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically get that. And that might be a safe thing for some sea creatures. But sea creatures as a rule are relative, not all of them, of course. Some of them can handle wide ranges of salinity. But sea creatures as a rule are somewhat sensitive to salinity, as are we. Humans are very, very sensitive to salinity. When we have too much salt, we get very, very sick. When we have too little salt, we can get sick. We're sensitive to it. The reason we don't seem to think of it that much is because the water, the saline we tend to absorb is through our digestive systems, whereas some of these fish with very large surface areas absorb their salinity through their skin and through their gills. And that's how they get their salinity. So they're a lot more sensitive to it than we are. And through their food, I guess. But when you're surrounded, I think the essential issue is we're up on land, and the mass density of air is 1,000 times lower than the mass density of water. So whatever salt the water is going to deliver you when you're in water is going to be more intense than the amount very little salt's delivered through the air. And unless you're live near the ocean, you get sprayed on you. But we don't live in this ocean of salt water. We have a tiny ocean of salt water inside of us because our blood is approximately the salinity of ocean water. Approximately, it's roughly close. And I think there's a reason for that. If we were originally sea creatures, our blood is going to be optimized to supplying our cells with something that resembles seawater. All right, off the subject. The goal is to make an inexpensive, locally solar desalination system that can improve local economies and save lives. That's the new mission statement of cPanel. And the other mission of cPanel is to make the entire world get covered in snow so that we can ride snowmobiles whenever we want, wherever we want to go. Even if it means we having to destroy the earth to do so. At least we'll all die in this frozen wasteland with a smile on our face. Unless, what happens if they can't build enough snowmobiles? Oh man. Then snowmobiles are going to, like, if you have a snowmobile, that's like your chariot of the gods. Okay, we better not turn the entire earth into a winter wonderland, because then there won't be enough snowmobiles to go around for everybody. Oh, but you'd be able to snowmobile on the oceans. Oh man. Oh, that would be brilliant. Snowmobiling on the ocean.